Good morning, everyone. Perfect day for gardeners, right? Rain in the morning, sun in the afternoon. Perfect. Welcome to lecture number 2 in the Ollie Summer Series entitled Nature and the Garden. This is number 2 out of 3. Hello to both our folks here in the WCC auditorium as well as those online. I'm Leo Shedden, one of many volunteers here. I'll be your moderator today. Today's lecture is entitled, maybe it's right up there, Nature and the Garden, Native Plants for a Healthier Landscape. For those online, if you're having any issues, as you well know by now, call the Ollie office. The number's in your paper catalog, or if you can get to the website, you can get the phone number there. They'll help you out. As is usually the case, we'll have a presentation followed by a Q&A session. As is usually the case, and I can't imagine there's an issue. The views you hear may or may not be those of U of M or Ollie, right? Please note that online we're using the Zoom webinar format. You cannot be seen or heard, but you can submit questions. Please do so in the Q&A link on your screen. We'll handle those questions along with questions from those in the room who have the 3x5s available to you for that purpose. To go off script slightly, you may have seen recently in the obits the obit of Esther Rubin, a long-time volunteer here at Ollie. She lived to be 100, and among all the other things listed she had done, she holds the record in the Dexter to Ann Arbor 10K race for 80 and over. She also held it for 75 through 79, and she ran her last 10K at age 85. There may be a clue there as to how she lived to be 100. Looking ahead to Ollie events upcoming, we're in the wind-down phase of our academic year like any other academic institution. It is June, wind-down time. There are 2 more events. One is the closure of this series 1 week from today. We're going to hear from the director of the Mathai Botanical Gardens, who's also the director of the Nichols Arboretum at U of M. That's in the morning a week from today at 10 a.m. At 2 in the afternoon will be the conclusion of the Zeckelman Holocaust series. It's a Zoom-only event. It's been going on for 10 months, I guess, since last September. This will be the closure on that topic. And now for today's speaker, and one thing about today's speaker, she's agreed to join us for lunch at Paisano's afterward. If you'd like to join that, there are a few extra seats. Join us. It can be a good time to ask specific questions, perhaps about things in your garden that are not behaving the way you thought they should. So join us for lunch if you're interested in that kind of thing. With that, I'll introduce Camille Orso, a key part of the planning team that made this lecture series possible. Camille will introduce our speaker for today. Camille?
Thanks, Leo. I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker, Loris Damerow, to our series today. Loris is a lifelong gardener and native plant enthusiast. She serves as the Ann Arbor Wild Ones chapter vice president, and also she's the president of the national organization. Wild Ones is a not-for-profit education and advocacy organization promoting native plant landscapes for a healthy environment. Loris is a recent transplant from Wisconsin, where I understand she had a fabulous garden. And she currently engages in earth stewardship in her own Michigan garden. Please welcome Loris to the podium.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, Nature and the Garden. What a beautiful title for a lecture series. It sounds so right, and yet, when you think about it, what does nature have to do with gardening? I'm Loris Damerow, and my husband and I moved to Ann Arbor in the summer of 2020. And we live with our daughter and our son-in-law and our 2 grandchildren, who are now 6 and 4 years old. My gardening history has always taken place in the Midwest, but that is west of Lake Michigan. And I'm having a wonderful time learning about this region and the soils and the plants east of Lake Michigan. And for me, I found that Ann Arbor really is a gardening paradise. It's 2 whole growing seasons warmer than Appleton, which is near Green Bay in Wisconsin. And here I can grow black gum and pawpaw and all kinds of interesting things that I was not able to grow before. So I'd like to share with you today my own process of becoming a native plant enthusiast and why native plants are essential for our ecological survival. And when it comes to saving the planet, being in relationship with native plants and co-creating that food web habitat is even more fun than recycling. The pictures that I have to show you today were taken by me, and unless they are otherwise noted on the slide. So on this gardening journey, we have to examine our own history. And that's our history with yards and what we value and what has been our practice. And thinking back to my own childhood, I have very particular images of what is a good garden or what is a good landscape. And what comes to mind are my great Aunt Gracie's peonies and sitting on that porch when I was 9 and taking in those lavish blooms and that incredible smell. I mean, who doesn't just love a peony? I grew up in a yard with a wide perennial border, English style, with daylilies and oriental poppies and a few cultivars of native plants thrown in. And my parents were really great gardeners. My dad liked to trim his evergreens with precision and arrange rocks and gravel and Japanese maples for dynamic effect. And they were beautiful landscapes to grow up in. And of course, much of that urban landscape or suburban landscape include plenty of lawn. Indeed, grass provides a great place to play. I mean, turf grass under your toes really feels great, and it makes a wonderful path through a landscape. But of course, grass has to be mowed every week, and growing up in my family, no one really liked to mow grass, but, you know, it got done. Some people really like to cut grass. Years ago, my husband spent most Saturdays in the seat of his riding mower, and he was soothed by the patterns that it would make in the grass. And regardless of the noise and the fumes, he really enjoyed the process. And certainly turf grass has become a staple of the American home landscape for decades. So what about nature? When I think of nature, I think of being up north, camping, maybe spotting those white hankies of trilliums in the forest. We went into nature. We went away from our home to see it. I remember visiting nearby nature, which was walking through a hillside of shooting stars in the farmer's woods near my home, and I did find nature there, but that was 60 years ago. Most people now would be hard-pressed to find a shooting star or even a farmer's woods that wasn't inundated with invasive shrubs. I grew up gardening and also with nature, but they were 2 separate events. My mother was an avid bird watcher and would insist that the bird feeder was filled before anyone could have breakfast. We cared about nature, but we didn't know that a landscape could provide so much more in the way of service in a more natural and integrated way. My mom did have a wildflower garden, and it was way up on the hill. It was under some oak trees, up under a wire fence, next to a wire fence, and it was full of maidenhair fern and marybells and red trillium and white violets and rue anemone. And at the age of 91, she left her home and the gardens that she had tended for 60 years. The plants that she missed the most were in the wildflower garden. Something about that moist, humusy soil and crumbling logs, and all the time she spent pulling out the garlic mustard that had crept over from the neighbor's untended plot. Now, I have neither horticulture nor science background. although I was a master gardener for a while. Yet nature and gardening is becoming more of an absorption for me. I'm an art therapist by training and spent many years in the field of hospice and grief and bereavement. And when, in 2000, I needed a break, I took time off to design flower gardens and draw up landscape plans and installed plants for other people. This particular job pictured here even made it into an edition of Chicagoland Gardening magazine. At this time, I had not yet made the shift from ornamental horticulture to a larger perspective. I had not yet shifted my frame of reference from pretty to ecologically useful. My orientation was very similar to being an interior designer, only out of doors. I would think, oh yeah, see that red barberry? Oh, that color will look so great in front of that red brick house. And I knew how to make plants grow, but I was not very discriminating about what I was growing. And as it turns out, Berberis thunbergii, or Japanese barberry, is a species native to Japan and Eastern Asia and has widely naturalized in China and North America. It has become a problematic invasive in many places, leading to declines in species diversity and actually increases tick habitat due to the moisture that is retained at the base of the plant. It is now 20 years later that red barberry is finally being banned for sale in states like New York and Connecticut, but it's still for sale in Michigan. There are many species like this, currently 76 identified in our state, that are causing harm because of their rapacious behavior. Many of these are still for sale as ornamental plants in the nursery trade because we are not altering our thinking about what to plant and why. And you can see my Japanese barberry in that long list, along with James rocket and Japanese knotweed and Canada thistle, English privet, glossy buckthorn, autumn olive, black locust, and more. Last year, I was invited out to look at a woods in our area whose forest floor was really covered in barberry, which effectively eliminated everything else. And it was being removed at great expense by the owner of the woodlot. I was in the Upper Peninsula last month, and I found a large patch of green barberry in a remote logging road. My passion for native plants may be in part because of the atonement for my horticultural mistakes. What is an invasive plant? Well, it's one that is not native to the ecosystem. And non-native species are those that were not present in Michigan's ecological communities prior to European settlement. And someone asked me right before the presentation, you know, what makes it non-native? Or how far back do we have to go to worry about it? And it's basically about 250 years is when things really started to change. Now, not all non-natives are considered invasive, although more and more are being added each year to the list. Some have been with us a long time, but we are just now beginning to feel the pain. In 1736, Oriental bittersweet, a vine native to Eastern Asia, was thought to be introduced as an ornamental. Now, that's quite a long time ago. And naturalized plants of this have been collected in Connecticut about 100, 120 years ago. But now it has spread to be invasive in 21 of 33 states where it's cultivated. And this plant can strangle and take down even an oak or a shagbark hickory. And I noticed that there are acres of it pulling down trees in Ann Arbor. Dandelion was thought to be brought over on the Mayflower and used in winemaking, but at least that plant provides nectar to our early pollinators and is really more a problem in lawns than in nature. And the problem with these non-native plants is that they invade. They take up space that would normally be inhabited by native species. Often these plants have biological advantages. They green up earlier in the spring and they start to reproduce. Some produce allelopathic substances that retard the growth of other plants, and many have no natural predators, meaning they don't have anything that eats it. So invasive species can sometimes outcompete and often win over our native plants. And when that happens, we have loss of diversity. We have loss of natural habitat. Now, you might not notice this unless you have invasives in your own garden, like the creeping bellflower that really plagues me. Every year it comes back, and when just a little piece of it remains in the soil, it can still regenerate and bloom in no time. And I had inherited a lot of this in my garden, my new garden here in Ann Arbor, and I thought I was being so clever when I smothered it in cardboard and mulch and pulled it back after waiting an entire year. And the next year I realized I did nothing except fertilize the darn thing. I have made progress in digging this out, but for the next 5 years, I will be going through my garden areas once a month looking for this little devil with bits that have escaped, and I will seek them out and remove them. There's nothing wrong with foreign species. That is, they're just species that evolved in other places, and they just don't have relationships with locally evolved species. They are not recognized nor nibbled on by most caterpillars, and the pollen, nectar, and fruiting patterns that they have just don't match our North American plants. Garlic mustard and buckthorn, two major invasives, are the first to turn green in the spring, and they get a head start on growing and reproductive competition. And at least you can see them greening up in the spring and remove them early, but usually nobody does. And so these plants get a head start and they use their extra energy to grow and spread. Every year, the list of invasives grows, and right now we are looking at 76 identified species. Where there were once hundreds and hundreds of native species in the environment doing their part in the ecological web, but in so many places, native plants have been extirpated, and invasive species all evolved someplace else. And indeed, some of our native species have become invasive in other continents. Well, besides invasive plants, what other threats are there to the biodiversity and habitat? Well, in a nutshell, there is not a lot of space to grow. Michigan's landscape has undergone major changes over the last century, and the places of these changes are rapidly increasing. In addition to direct habitat destruction and sprawling development patterns, we're continuing to fragment Michigan's remaining forests and grasslands and wetlands. Hydrologic rerouting, increased paving services, and stormwater runoff have resulted in the loss of wetlands. Decades' use of pesticides and herbicides in farming and residential landscapes has drastically altered our soils and water. The practice of growing single-crop monocultures, corn and soybeans, for instance, have resulted in fewer and fewer places for nature to go. And of course, long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns are putting stress on our species' resiliency. Some say that we're now in the age of the Anthropocene, or human age, a new geological time period where humans are dramatically influence Earth's ecosystems. And I don't believe we are going back. So this is why the movement towards natural landscaping and the reintroduction of natives is so important. So what is so special about native plants? Well, to put it in perspective, they have been here in Michigan a long time. They have co-evolved with other critters in the ecological food web. Native plants provide the food and shelter for insects and birds They are the foundation of terrestrial food webs and enable insect, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal populations to thrive. They've been here a couple 100 million years before mankind, and it behooves us to keep them around a little bit longer. Landscaping with native plants helps restore healthy ecosystems, and native gardens are a buffet for butterflies and bees and other pollinators. Farms and gardens interplanted with native plants result in higher crop yields, and human life is dependent on healthy pollinator populations to provide for our food sources. In fact, pollinators are responsible for 1 in every 3 bites that we take. We are just now learning how particular this relationship is, how particular their functions are. In 2007, Doug Tallamy, entomologist and ecologist, published the book Bringing Nature Home, highlighting in his research the specific ways that birds and insects interact. And this identified the dependent relationship with co-evolved native plants. His book highlighted the dramatic loss of habitat across the US, and being an entomologist, spoke to the growing awareness of global insect decline. More than 50% of insect species are declining, and a third are endangered, and reports indicate that insect populations are declining as much as 2.5% annually, and at this rate we are looking at extinction within a century. Insects are essential for the proper functioning of all ecosystems, as they serve as food for other creatures, for pollinators, as decomposers and recyclers of nutrients. And if there is any doubt about this decline, think back in your own lifetime about the bugs on your windshield. When was the last time you had to clean your windshield at a gas station? The windshield phenomena is the observation that fewer dead insects will accumulate on your windshield or on the bumpers or the front of people's cars, and there has been a noticeable decline since the turn of the 21st century. And there are many biological surveys to back this up. Tallamy also presented some startling learning regarding insect behavior and lifestyle patterns. Dr. Tallamy identified that most herbivore insects that would be those that eat plants, are specialists. In fact, 90% are specialists. They only eat certain plants, and most all of those plants are native species. Our most famous specialist is the monarch. He's more or less the poster child for specialists. I mean, most fourth graders know that monarchs have to have milkweed, and because the monarch is a welcome and familiar butterfly, we tend to pay more attention to butterflies because they're pretty and they're flying around during the day and we see them, rather than the moths, who provide greater pollinator service but fly at night. And because of monarchs, we're more aware of the decline of butterfly populations in general, and there has been a lot of decline. The Midwest monarch has declined 96% in the last 20 years, and the California population by 99%. There are 11 species of milkweed in Michigan, and here's swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed, and then there's world milkweed, poke milkweed, Sullivan's milkweed, and more. These are all the different species of Asclepias that the monarch can use for food. So how did this dependency happen? Well, it came to us through coevolution. And the monarch caterpillar, as bright and distinctive as this caterpillar is, doesn't taste very good to birds. Well, why is that? It's because they only eat milkweed. Have you ever snapped off a milkweed stem and gotten your fingers in that kind of milky, latexy sap? Well, the caterpillars are protected from being eaten by carrying the milkweed's protective chemicals, or the cardenolides, in their bodies through eating the latexy substance that milkweed provides. The cardenolides have some toxicity and also protect the caterpillar from parasites, so birds don't eat them. When you have a few million years, things tend to sort themselves out in rather elegant ways. Monarch butterflies gather pollen and nectar, nectar being food, from many types of flowers, and they need that nectar for endurance as they make their migration journey through Texas to Mexico. So it's important to have fall blooming flowers like goldenrod and ironweed or asters with available blooms to provide nectar for them in the fall so that they can gather strength before they make their trip. Many butterflies and moths are specialists requiring host plants. In fact, most herbaceous insects are specialists rather than generalists. They must have a particular plant on which to lay eggs. And here are a few that you might want to have in your garden. And without these plants, they perhaps can nourish or dine, if you will, in your garden, but they cannot reproduce. They are utterly dependent upon particular native plants. So let us look at some of those. The pearl crescent requires asters. The black swallowtail needs golden alexanders or parsley and dill. The common wood nymph must have the buttonbush shrub, which luckily we have, it grows plentifully here in Ann Arbor. The American lady requires the pearly everlasting, and I just saw a caterpillar of this type at Mathi last week. The eastern swallowtail lays eggs on native cherry and plum trees. The little wood satyr needs bottlebrush grass or Elymus hystrix, which is an attractive tall grass for shade. And the list of species from the point of view of the plants, we can find that some species provide much more service than others. Not all insects are specialists, some are generalists, and Doug Tallamy and his crew have done their research and determined which native plant species provide the best ecological return. So, which species give you the biggest insect bang for your buck? Well, the top of the list is the oak, providing support to 557 species of insects. In fact, Dr. Tallamy has written an entire book about the ecological value of oak trees. And you got to admit, whether you're a larval caterpillar or a bird or a squirrel or a human, oaks are pretty great. The next species is birch with 411 species, and then the willows and cherries, who support 455 and 456 species respectively. Even the difference between a native maple and a non-native maple is significant. For instance, a sugar maple supports 297 species, but a Norway maple maybe a dozen. So this reveals the ecological value of natives. And who does this ecological distinction matter to so very much? Well, it matters a lot to the birds. There's only about 4% of birds who eat seeds and nuts, and not insects. And what birds especially need caterpillars? Well, baby birds. Dr. Tallamy identified that caterpillars are 80% of the food for nestlings. Yeah, sure, we've seen robins pull up worms, etc., and chickadees will catch gnats and katydids and feed them to their young, but caterpillars are the most nutritious food. They provide more protein per ounce than is found in beef, and it takes a lot of caterpillars to raise a clutch of chickadees. In fact, a pair of chickadees needs 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of chickadees. And Dr. Tallamy and his staff have counted them. Tallamy and his associates found that chickadees, for them to successfully nest, they need to have native plants supporting insects within 50 feet of the nest, and that birds seek out landscapes that have at least 60% native plants. So if you don't have native plants and you don't have caterpillars, you won't have healthy baby birds. What you plant in your yard makes a difference, especially to birds. Now, in the last decade, there's been much more research available about this, and you can go online to National Wildlife Foundation, and they spell out the most potent native plants for our region, which is Ecoregion 8, the Eastern Temperate Forest, which would be plants east of the Mississippi. And this chart lists the top host pollinator plants. When you think about your yard, keep this in mind. Any single creature you see is only around because of the many relationships with other species. Oh, you can have Aunt Gracie's peonies. They're not invasive, but it's important to have other natives have natives as well. Ptolemy suggests that you have 60% or more in your landscapes. Now, there are many things contributing to the decline of bird populations. Almost 1 billion birds have been lost in the last 50 years. That's about a third of the total bird population since 1970. And they have discovered that a loss of habitat is perhaps the most critical factor. So, what's the good news? Well, by using and incorporating native trees and shrubs and vines and ferns and grasses and flowering perennials, you can assure a better support for your food web and its diverse array of life. And natives make it almost easy to do that. Why? Because natives are tough. This is the famous roots diagram, which illustrates the root systems of these prairie species. And all these plants have evolved together in place with particular soils and climate, and they have root systems that share and utilize the water, minerals, and microbes. And you can see here in this picture, prairie dock goes down maybe 15 feet into the soil, and blue stem 6 feet. And these plants are very well adapted to survive drought, compared with the Kentucky bluegrass at the right, that little tiny strip on the right, with its tiny, shallow 2-inch root system. Natives require less water, and because natives have such an extensive root system, they require less babysitting. The first year, they do need regular watering to get established, but once established, they can withstand a drought. I'll just say a word or two about lawns. I mentioned that they feel good between our toes, but they are kind of a ridiculous crop to grow and cut every week. And yet they are the #1 irrigated crop in America, lawns. There are about 50 million acres of lawns in the US. That could be 50 million acres of natural habitat. In addition, lawn mowing uses up 200 million gallons of gas every year. And gas-powered lawnmowers are hugely polluting, contributing 4 to 5% of our national air pollution quotient. The typical American landscape does not provide net positive for ecofunction. In fact, it can do harm to animals and people and to the soil itself. This is not an eco-friendly environment, much less an ecologically diverse one. Lawns require moisture throughout the growing season to keep that shallow root system going, and fertilizers and pesticides to keep it green. And chemicals can run off the surface of the lawn and leach down into the groundwater. Kentucky bluegrass is not even native to Kentucky. It's native to the Middle East. The typical lawn is simply not sustainable. It's not exactly sterile, but it's in a deeply impoverished environment. Now, native plants can do it all. They make for a healthier landscape. They hold water in wetlands and rain gardens. They store carbon in the ground through their deep roots, and together plants and soil microbes can absorb an estimated 30% of the CO2 emitted by human activities each year. They increase habitat in magnificent ways, and they require less water, so there's less usage. They reduce pollution by cleaning water through the process called biofiltration. They do not require pesticides nor fertilizer, and they lower energy consumption because they have fewer special needs. Native plants provide multiple benefits for building a healthy environment. And if that were not enough, natives are beautiful. Here we have anise hyssop, cup plant, butterfly weed, and some switchgrass in the back, all providing ecological and visual beauty. And of course, native plants come in all shapes and sizes. Native plants can be petite, like the prairie smoke on your left and tiarella, foamflower, on your right, just a few inches high. They can also be big. Here's a native climbing rose called Rosa satigera, and when I got this plant, it was about as big as my thumb. And after moving it a few times and finding the right spot and growing it up for a few years, it became about the size of a queen-size mattress. The one on the right is wild senna. It's in the pea family and looks quite tropical. Native plants can provide eye-popping color. Purple coneflower and bee balm on the left, and on the right, the stunning native, almost fluorescent orange butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. Here we have lovely texture, demonstrated in grasses, prairie dropseed, Sprobolus heterolepsis on the left, and this very cool seersucker sedge, Carex plantagina, surrounding the sculpture on the right. And for shape, well, nothing beats the rattlesnake master. For interesting shape, it looks like some kind of space-age sculpture. And then Rudbeckia subtomentosa, or sweet black-eyed Susan on the right, with that radial daisy shape that is so familiar and so pleasing. How about this for contrast? Two versions of red and white. On the left, mountain mint with cardinal flower, and on the right, artemisia, or sage, and royal catchfly. Notice the difference in foliage texture between the plants as well. Natives can be grown in containers, just like an annual. Here is snake root that is grown right alongside with the geraniums. On the right is a climbing vine grown up on a trellis, and this is our native honeysuckle, one of our native honeysuckles called coral honeysuckle. Native plants can be selected for their tidy look with wide spacing between them, lots of mulch, clear paths, and there's actually lists of native plants that tend to stay put and don't flop. And I've had that as requirements of people saying, well, I don't want any plants that flop. And if this is the look you want, you can have that. And did I mention the leaves? Well, it's a good idea for, if you want to support insect life, is to leave the stems up for winter for native bees. And insects nest in their stems and cocoon over winter to emerge in the spring. And the duff or leaf litter that you leave behind becomes the habitat for insects, and also provides a soil covering to retain moisture and keep out weeds. And the leaf litter will break down over time to become microbial-rich soil. I mentioned the volume of insects that are needed, and there's so many insects that munch in their caterpillar stage up in the tops of our native trees. But to complete their reproductive cycle, they fall out of the canopy onto the ground, and they need a place to go. They need a soft landing where they can burrow in over winter. And a mowed lawn is a tough habitat for a bug. They just can't penetrate the ground. So it's good to make space for soft landings around trees. Create an area of ground that is not lawn or not hardscaping around your mature trees. And of course, natives can look wild. And here's a prehistoric-looking prairie dock and some bee balm and grasses, living it up in a prairie-like planting. But tidy or wild, it's important to create some boundaries and borders so plantings look intentional. This can be done with a spade or a cut edge, or a mowed edge, or fencing, or a stone border. This signals to the viewer that this is an intended design and not just a neglected patch of weeds. Lots of material can be used for edging, and various materials can be used for mulch, rock, leaves, pine bark, and more. Turf grass, once again, makes a great path rather than the main event. Paths are an important part of your landscape, whether even if the whole yard is planted, it helps to guide your feet through the landscape and guide your eye through the landscape, and it provides a great visual break from all that green foliage. And along this path, in this shade garden, we have perfoliate bellwort and goatsbeard and a smooth hydrangea. A water feature is also a wonderful asset when creating a habitat for wildlife. There are native plants perfectly suited to wet environments, and here's cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis, and also blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica. And being around water is wonderfully appealing for humans as well as animals. Water offerings don't need to be elaborate to provide benefit to birds and animals and insects. It just needs to be clean and regularly replenished. Here's an in-ground fountain surrounded by black-eyed Susans, and on the right, a planting of prairie dropseed in kind of a dry environment that hosts a simple container of water. More involved water features that replicate natural ponds and wetlands can, of course, be incorporated into a wide range of landscapes depending on your motivation and on your budget. I mean, who doesn't love a sanctuary, be it a winged creature or a four-legged or us two-leggeds? Native plants surround children for play, as this naturally landscaped yard in Northville demonstrates. This landscape features Joe Pyeweed in the foreground. See the lovely spring blooming columbine? Here, native plants, as well as some very nicely placed rocks, provide for a beautiful health strip. In fact, you can hardly even call it a health strip. Who said that you can't have hummingbirds on a busy urban street? This pale purple coneflower and royal catchfly are great hummingbird attractors. Native plants can be utilized in the most unexpected places, like a park in downtown Ann Arbor. The fish are swimming right through the natives. Or even a botanic garden. Our Mathai has a whole selection called the Great Lakes Garden with over 100 species exclusively of native plants. This photo is from Mathai's display garden showing purple coneflower, which is a very attractive and sturdy, almost classic, long-blooming native. And native plants can be found right outside your own front door if you plant them there. And this is at Cornus, Florida, one of our native flowering dogwoods in the early spring. Natives provide full service all through the year, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Plants providing ecological service 24/7. Yes, those native plants, they really do it all. And by incorporating even just a few plants, be it a shrub or a clump of grass, or choosing a native tree to replace one in your yard, that can make a big difference in the circle of life that is around us. So let's look at some landscapes that have done just that. The photo on the left is from a group in Connecticut called Pollinator Pathways, and they organize their community conservation groups to establish pollinator-friendly habitat along a series of continuous corridors throughout connected neighborhoods. And the photo on the right is courtesy of Blooming Boulevards in Ontario, whose goal is to create networks of residential boulevard gardens to serve as corridors for pollinators. The photo on the left was taken last June in Ann Arbor, and it is an exquisitely designed private garden, and it's beautifully maintained, and this is on the southwest side of A2. And the photo on the right is a unique above-ground rain garden located in Ann Arbor's northeast side. This garden is home to one of our Wild One chapter officers, Bob, who is a master gardener. And in 2009, he got tired of coaxing his hydrangeas to bloom and slowly converted everything in his front yard to natives. He filled that up, and in 2019 started in on his backyard, which is the picture on the right. And currently, his front yard has 75% natives, and his backyard, 99.9% natives. And as mentioned at the beginning of this talk, we moved from Ann Arbor to Appleton, Wisconsin in 2020. And here is the house that we bought when we moved to Appleton in 2008. This is the somewhat unfortunate-looking real estate photo from that time period. And it has, as you can see, a classic American landscape with a lawn and foundation yews. And over the years, I set to work to make it a natural landscape and to fill it with native plants. About 10 years later, a very different look was created, which features a lot of interest, a lot of color, a lot of biological diversity, and yields ecological service. There's blue vervain and wild quinine, pale purple coneflower, butterfly milkweed, giant coneflower, queen of the prairie, yellow cornflower, pagoda dogwood. And you might also notice that the house got re-sided in that process. It went from light stucco to dark brown. And it sounds crazy, but I'm so pleased that the house sets off the plants so nicely. Ironweed, Culver's root, and more. And sure enough, there were many rewards. Nature began to arrive. And here is something that arrived one day, a black swallowtail on the bottlebrush buckeye. You too can make a difference in your yard or in your community by choosing native plants. An ecosystem is a complex system, and it can be overwhelming when it comes to knowing how to sew a garment of environmental repair. Here is my new yard in Ann Arbor, and it is a lot to tackle, and it will take me time to convert this residential acre into something diverse and inviting. So the first thing to do is to take stock. Look around and inventory what you have to work with. Start small, unless you're a nut like me. It makes sense to begin in a small corner, maybe slowly replacing old plants with natives, or maybe even just pulling out the edge of a bed, even just a foot or two each year, and incorporating some natives there, and identifying the areas that you wish to tackle, and then dreaming about what more you can do. Another important thing is what you have to do if you have a yard like I inherited, which is to remove the invasives. There was about 4,000 square feet of planted beds that were covered in English ivy and vinca, and worst of all, lily of the valley. And here is a bale of English ivy that my daughter helped me roll up, just like sod, to take it away. In 2002, I went through the Washtenaw County Rain Gardener program, and it was wonderful to have people like the speakers from last week from the Ollie Lecture to really walk me through it. And there's a picture on the right of my rain garden after I put it in. And of all crazy things on this property, there was a sand volleyball court. And as I said, I live here with my husband and my children and my grandchildren, and I immediately said, we don't need a sand volleyball court. We don't have enough for a team. I'm going to convert this into a sand prairie. And so I started that first year laying out paths and growing up plants and learning about what will grow in this fast-draining soil. In Appleton, my soil was completely clay. And so this was and this continues to be a whole new experience. And now I have the beginnings of some really diverse plants and some fun. So what are the takeaways? Well, what can you do in your home or in your community landscape to make it more ecologically rewarding? Well, of course, plant natives. You can reduce your turf, even just a little bit. You can create soft landings for the insects. You can leave the leaves, and you can leave the stalks standing. And it's also helpful to have water available. Oh, and did I say plant natives? Yeah, do that. Another easy thing to do is to join Wild Ones. Wild Ones is a member-supported, volunteer-driven organization with local chapters. We have 133 chapters in 34 states. And in recent months, we just reached 10,000 members nationwide, and I'm really excited about that. Wild Ones is about connecting people and native plants for a healthy planet. Wild Ones supports natives through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. And we hold this vision, and I think we can do this, of native plants and natural landscaping thriving in every community. And by joining a national organization, you become a member of, if you join nationally, you become a member of the Ann Arbor Wild Ones chapter. And we have monthly programs and yard tours and events all through the year. And we provide a wealth of resources locally and nationally on how to create natural landscapes. And the national program offers native plant design layouts and plant lists. Our area is rich in resources for plant material. Where I came from in Wisconsin, there was really only one native plant grower, and it was a wonderful mail order production. But here in Ann Arbor, we have a lot of native plant growers. Well, relatively speaking, a lot. Last night, I was just in Plymouth, and was there a new native plant grower, Michigansea Natives, opened up last month with Adam Huddlesteen. So that's pretty exciting to be able to go and shop. Ann Arbor, our national Wild Ones and our local Wild Ones also has videos for you and webinars available. There is a tremendous volume of information out there on how to live in harmony with nature. And here are some of the websites and some organizations that may be of interest to you and where you can find more information. Taking action to repair the environment, starting at home, is empowering. Native plants play an important role in combating climate crisis. And think about the way we garden and how landscaping must change, because the earth has changed. And while we all love those peonies, and there's no reason why we can't have them in our garden, they should be there alongside native plants as well. We must think broader and bigger and richer than the end of our nose. I hope this talk has inspired you to think about your yard in a different way and know that if you plant it, they will come. Thank you.
Let's thank our speakers. Thank you very much, Lois Damerow, Wild Ones Organization. We now know a lot more about it. This is a great time for questions, those online and those in the audience. We have an expert here, probably many in the audience actually, but we have a real expert at the podium. Bring your questions forward. Let me look online for a second to see what we have. Can you mention any annuals and hanging baskets? I live in a condo and don't have a lot of space. Any comment on annuals and hanging baskets?
Most native plants are perennials, although we do have a number of annuals as well. But I have to say, I'm not far along enough to think of an annual that would go, a native annual that we could find propagated that would go into a hanging basket. But you could also put a perennial, like that white snakeroot that I showed, in a hanging basket. Now, the bloom time won't be as long. Annuals tend to bloom for weeks and longer, petunias, for instance. But it will give you some color.
So there are perennials that could serve the purpose here, I think you're saying, eh?
Yeah, I would say just use a native perennial. Yeah. And I haven't really put that together of what about a hanging basket, but it's something I will definitely consider. And that's something that the national organization is looking into. When we first kind of got into this, actually the organization has been around for about 35 years, but growing very slowly until the last 5 or 6 years, where it's tripled in size because of people's interest in native plants. But originally we were thinking about native plant restorations or natural area restorations. And really it's more current that we've been thinking, how can individuals kind of swap out native plants for some of the traditional bedding plants that we have. And that's actually on the agenda, on the docket for this year for National to be figuring out. So I hope to have some better answers for that.
Great first question. Let's move on. Another question from online. Someone has a rain garden from about 20 years ago. Several of the plants are spreaders. They're asking, how can I get some help on which plants are spreaders and which are not, and what can be done to keep spreaders from spreading?
Yeah, pull them out. That's really the best way, is to watch what's happening in your area, and feel free to pull them out and put them in other parts of the yard or give them to other people. But it's okay to take them out and maybe put in something else, or just let them come more if they've exceeded the area that you have designated for that plant. The Master Gardener people have on their website I think a good list. Gosh, Susan has so many lists of specialized plants, and I think there is one about those that tend to be more spreading and those that are not.
Good, thanks. Into the audience here. Craig, do you have one on that side?
Should we put invasive plants in compost bins? If not, what's the alternative?
Yes, I think it's safe to put them in our Ann Arbor compost bins because the composting process in Ann Arbor is pretty complete. So they do some very hot composting, which should kill all the seeds. I think you're pretty confident with that.
Thanks.
Let me just comment a bit on some of your remarks and some of the data you threw out. 60% decline in mammals and other species, other wild live species, let's call it. That's not 60% decline in species, it's 60% decline in quantity?
Yes.
Scary thought.
Yeah.
Over 50 years, I'm sure we can all remember 1970, right? That's not that long ago. It's 60% decline. That's a shocking figure. Yeah. Other things I made note of here, goldenrod, it makes me sneeze, right? Some things.
No,
No, it doesn't?
no,
It does.
no. Ragweed makes you
Ragweed
sneeze.
makes me sneeze.
Yes, goldenrod is not an allergen. That's a misnomer.
That's a misnomer.
Yeah.
So when I'm sneezing away in the fall,
Don't
Not
blame
blame
goldenrod.
goldenrod.
Yeah.
how about like growth in cracks in my driveway, and I had read strong doses of vinegar. Yes?
Yeah.
Safe?
Sure.
A little salt added?
Sure.
Soap?
Yeah, the salt over time may leach out into areas of your yard, but you'll probably be able to notice that. But vinegar should be pretty safe, and then, of course, it breaks down pretty fast.
Maybe others in the room are well aware of that, but vinegar at like at really strong level to the point the container says poison, right? Will
Yeah.
serve the purpose. All right. Catherine?
What alternative ground cover plants could you substitute for turf grass?
Oh, gosh. Wild strawberry is a wonderful ground cover. Silverweed is a good ground cover. There's a creeping potentilla that's a good ground cover. Wild ginger is terrific for shade. And I would go to, actually, Audubon has a tab on their website where you can go in and look at the plants and how they're applied for our region.
Good, thanks. Craig, do you have on that side?
Yes, I do. Is there a native equivalent of turf grass?
Yeah, there are, it's fescues, there's native fescues and carex sedges that are fine. It's kind of called no-mow grass. And where I would go, I'm sure there's other sources, but the one I'm most familiar with is Prairie Nursery. Even though it's in Westfield, Wisconsin, they have really great information on how you prepare the soil to, how you install a no-mow grass.
What is that name in Wisconsin again?
Prairie Nursery.
Prairie Nursery.
Prairie Nursery.
Thanks.
Question for the audience. I have a lot of trouble with poison ivy. Who has poison ivy problems in your growing life? Yes? Only a couple, only a few. Wow. What to do about poison ivy?
Yeah.
Keep your hands off of it.
Yeah, yeah. I have to, the two methods would be to pull it, dig it out and bag it and dispose of it. I'm so clumsy, though. Even when I do that with gloves and everything, I still tend to get it on me. So, and I haven't mentioned this before, but I do use herbicide selectively and very, very judiciously and carefully. And that would be Roundup. And this is not an official statement by the Wild Ones organization or even our local Wild Ones. I'm just telling you what I do. So,
We just had a confession.
yeah, you
right?
did.
But the strong vinegar, beyond,
That is actually, that supercharged vinegar, that's actually worth a try. And I'm going to get some spray bottles and set up some experiments. I've never read anything about that being applied to poison ivy, but it is certainly worth a try.
the recipe I found, maybe everybody's aware of this, strong vinegar, a lot of salt, and some dish soap to, I think, promote adhesion.
Oh, yeah,
And I find it works.
yeah, good.
All right, other comments, questions from the audience? You besmirched the name of Norway maple at one point.
Yes.
What's the problem with Norway maple?
Well, it's a tree that it did not evolve with our native plants, and it was introduced as an ornamental, and it is now on the list of one of the 76 species on the Michigan invasive species list. In other words, it is spreading into our natural forests, and as I mentioned, it just doesn't provide the ecoservice return because the insects don't recognize it as a place to lay their eggs. So, a sugar maple, 250 some insects, a Norway maple, I think it's maybe a dozen. So, and also the leaves of a Norway maple are very tough. It takes a number of years for a maple leaf, a Norway maple leaf, to deteriorate. They just don't break down. They're like leather. So that makes a difference too.
Similar name, but a totally, totally different tree. Norway spruce. They're on the
Yeah.
good guy list?
Yeah, well, they're not on the invasive species list.
Okay.
So,
On
yeah.
the neutral list.
Yeah.
All right, last call. Catherine.
Question. I'm not a gardener at all, and your talk has incentivized me to start a native garden. But do you have sources of people who will do this if I pay them?
Yes. Yes. Just go to the Ann Arbor Wild Ones site, and there's a tab for services. I think it's under resources, and then under the resources, there's services. And there are at least a dozen, and we need more and more. I mean, this is a growing industry, definitely, on how to effectively do native landscaping. And it's a little bit more complicated than just sending out the mowing crew and trimming everything up and then going away. But we have some wonderful folks who can provide services for that.
Great. Last call. Craig? Catherine? Thank you very much to our speaker.
Thank you.
And last call, join us for lunch. If you have an interest in joining us for lunch, come on down and speak to Camille or I. Thanks again.